Today I'm going to go through how you can add a product tour to a single page application in Bubble. You'll see here I'm on the first tab of our single page application, and if I click on next we're taken to another step in the tour, and then we go on to the second tab where we also get to continue the tour and indeed finish it off. I'm going to leave the editor for this demo app in the description below so you can take a look at that if you want to see the specific steps that I've used. Before we get into building our product tour, I do want to highlight the structure of this particular application. This is a SPA or a single page application. That means that everything is housed within one page on our Bubble app. If we go back to our editor and go onto the index page, you'll see here I have this sidebar nav, which is a reusable element. And then I also have this group inside here, which is housing 3 more reusable elements: Views tab 1, Views tab 2, and Views tab 3. And essentially, I'm showing and hiding these various views based on whatever particular tab I'm in here. So if I click on tab 2 is going to appear in the URL. It's hiding the initial view that was there and the input fields, and it's showing a different one. And similarly, if I go to tab 3, we're getting a different set of inputs again. I'm not going into detail on how to create an application like this. I do have another video that shows you exactly what you need to do, and I will link to that below. Let's get into building our product tour. I'm just going to remove the visibility on those views for a second. And the first thing you're going to need to do is to go to the plugins tab of your Bubble editor and add in the A+ Onboarding Product Tour plugin. This is a paid plugin. It is one of the Cranford Tech plugins, and you can install it by either paying on a one-off basis or subscribing to it on a monthly plan. Once you have this plugin installed, you should see that you have access to this product tour element under the visual elements in your Bubble editor. What you're going to want to do is to grab one of them and put it in the group on your dashboard page. Now, it is important that you don't want to put this element in any of the views itself. So you can access these reusable views down here. You do not want to put it in here. You very much want to put it on the dashboard page where all those views are being housed. I'm just going to move that back up 1 just to make it a bit easier to see. And now that we have this product tour A element on our page, if we go to our workflow and if we click on when page is loaded, we're going to have access to a few new workflow actions. If you go down to element actions, you'll see here under product tour, we have 5 different actions. And the one we want to do straight away is add a step in a product tour. And this is going to be the first port of call when we're going through our product tour. And the way we're going to identify what element to highlight is using this element ID input field. Now, if we go on to an element in our views tab 1 and go through our design, there's not really, let's say I want to highlight this group A here. There's not really any way we can specify that this is the element we want to highlight. So what you need to do is go to settings, go to general, and then if you scroll down to the bottom, you'll see here under advanced options, there is expose the option to add an ID attribute to HTML elements. You're going to want to click that. And once you do, we're going to see that if we go down to the bottom of our group A element again, we now have this field called ID attribute. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to call this step 1. Then I'm going to go back to my workflow on the index page, which is our dashboard home. And I'm going to say when page is loaded, add a step in product tour A, and we're going to say step 1. We're simply going to say this is the first step, and the step description is simply going to say welcome to our tour. We're also going to need to actually start the tour, so let's go down to element actions, start a product tour, and we'll start product tour A. So we're adding a step to the tour, and then once that step has been added, we're going to start the tour. So let's refresh our app and just go back to the index page because that's going to display the very first tab by default. Okay, and you can see there, as soon as the page loads, we get our first step. What I would like to do is before we go to the initial element we're highlighting, I just want to give a general message. So I'm going to go again down to element actions, add a step, and I'm just going to say welcome to the product tour. And I'm not going to put any element ID in here because if we don't put an element ID, as you'll see in a second, we get this kind of message showing up in the center of the page. I'm just going to put a description in here. And then let's refresh again. So we're getting this general welcome message, and then we're going to the first step on our tour. So let's add in a second and third step now. So for the second step, what we're going to do is we go back to our Views tab 1 reusable element. Let's say we want to have a look at this group here. So we'll call this step 2. And if we go back to our index page, go to workflow, when the page is loaded, I'm just going to put that in here. So we're going to add a step in product tour again. This time we're going to give the element ID step 2. And we'll say this is second step and step 2 of tour. Is that consistent? Yeah. And then let's say we want our third step to be on a different tab here. So if we go to Views tab 2 and take a look at that, you can see here there's different input fields. Let's say we want to highlight this particular group over here. Let's call this step 3. And then if we go back to our index page and go to workflow, and we're going to add in that step 3, insert an action, and we're going to go to add a step in product tour, and we'll call this step 3, just keep the language consistent. We'll say this is the third step, and we'll say step 3. Shouldn't have done that. We'll say step 3 of tour. So we have a general welcome message, and then on the first tab we have step 1, step 2, and then on the second tab we've step 3, and then we're starting the tour. This is not going to work, and I'm going to show how not to do it first of all, just so it's clearer when we are implementing it correctly what you need to do. Let's refresh our page. And the general welcome message is absolutely fine. First step, absolutely fine. Second step, we're all good. But then we get to the third step, you can see we're still on the first tab, and this isn't attached to anything. And what's happening here is we've added this step to the tour, but the element that we want to add it to isn't visible on the page. So what we need to do to get around that is we're going to, instead of adding all of these steps on page load, we're going to create a couple of custom events. So the first custom event I'm going to create is going to be called load steps in tab 1 tour. And I'm just going to cut the steps from when page is loaded, the first 3 of them, into this custom event here. So this is the first one. I'm going to cut that, and I'm going to paste it in there. This is the second one. Cut, paste that in there. And similarly, we'll cut that one and paste that in there. We're going to create a second custom event then called load steps in tab 2 tour. And we're going to take this one, which is on the second tab, and we're going to paste it in there. And what we're trying to achieve here is we're going to trigger this tour, and when this tour is finished, we're then going to navigate to the second tab, and we're then going to load this additional step and continue the tour on. So at the moment when the page is loaded, we're simply starting product tour A. What we want to do is when the page is loaded, we want to load the steps in the first tour, which is in this custom event here. So we're going to custom events, we're going to trigger a custom event, and we're going to trigger the first one. So we're going to load those steps up, we're going to start the product tour, and then this plugin also gives us access to a number of different events here. So you can see here under elements, we have when a product tour is completed. And what we're going to do is we're going to say when product tour A is completed, we're going to navigate to a page. The page is going to be the index page, but the way you might remember I'm navigating between the various tabs is using the URL parameter at the end. You can see there at tab 2. So what we're going to do is we're going to send arbitrary text, and we're simply going to send get an option, tab 2, it's display. I didn't go into detail on what these are. Again, it's in the other video I have, but just very quickly, I have 3 options here to navigate between the various tabs. So when product tour A is completed, we're going to go to that page, essentially the second tab, and then what we can do is we can start another tour. What we do need to do to achieve that is we need to add another product tour element to our page. So I'm going to go down here again and just drop this in below the existing one. It's going to be product tour B. So let's go back to our workflow. At the moment, we're loading the page. We're loading up the first 3 steps in our tour, 1, 2, 3. Then we are starting that tour. So we're going to go through steps 1, 2, 3. When tour A is completed, we're going to go to the second tab. And then what we need to do is when the second tab is loaded, we need to trigger the next set of steps. So getting a bit more complex here, but hopefully you're following along. So we're going to say when the page is loaded, and we need something to define only when the second tab is loaded. So we're going to say only when get data from page URL, path segments as list. And again, this is all part of the SPAS single page application structure. And we're going to say item number 2 is get an option, tab 2, and it's display. So when we go to the second tab of our application, what we're going to do is we're going to trigger that custom event, which is load steps in tab 2 tour. And then we're going to start the second product tour. Start a product tour B. One thing I'm just conscious of at the moment, you can see here in the custom event, we're actually adding this step into product tour A. We want to put that into product tour B. Okay, we're not completely there, but this is a good indication of where we're going. Let's load up the application again. Okay, so we're on the first tab. You can see here, we're getting the general welcome message. We're going to the first step. We're going to the second step. And now you will notice this currently says done. That's obviously not ideal because there is another step that we want to complete. We can change that in a second. But let's go to the next step. And you can see here we have changed tabs and we have got the message up, but it's not connected to anything. So we're getting closer, but we're not quite there. What we need to do is, and you can see we have an issue with other steps loading. I'll come on and show you how to address that in a minute. But what we need to do is when that page loads, what we need to do is we need to give it a second to actually load the steps. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to insert an action, and I'm going to go to add a pause before the next action. And I'm just going to change this to call it, that's 400 milliseconds. I'm also going to go back, and as I mentioned at the moment, if we look at product tour A, you can see here the done button text says done. What we can do is we can just say next instead, and then it would look as though it's a continuous tour, even though in reality it is actually 2 separate tours. Okay, let's go back and refresh. So welcome to the product tour, step 1, step 2, on to the next tab, and then we're getting step 3 of the tour. But unfortunately, we also have this issue here where we're loading in the first step again. And why is that happening? Well, that's happening because you might remember when the page is loaded, we're loading in all the steps. And if we navigate between tab 1 and tab 2, Bubble considers that to be a page load. So what we need to do is we only want to do these actions here when get data from the page URL, path segments as list, when item number 2 is either empty or get data from page URL, path segments as list, when item number 2 is get an option, tab 1, its display. So we're only going to trigger the load steps in tab 1 tour and start product tour A if we're on the first tab, or if this item here is empty, because again, if we're on the index page with no tab, it defaults to tab 1. So let's refresh. Excellent, step 1, step 2, step 3, and you can see here then we're done. So this is progress. We can now do our tour correctly, but we're not completely there yet, because if we go back to tab 1 now, we're going to start the tour again, and even worse than that, we're going to get the welcome message again one more time. And what's happening is, we are going back to the first tab. So once again, it's adding a new set of steps. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into my reusable elements, and I'm going to go to views in tab 1. I'm going to click on design, and then I'm going to click on the reusable element itself, and I'm going to create a custom state. And this custom state is going to be called steps added ? And it's going to be a yes or a no field. The default is going to be no. And then what I'm going to say is when we're back on our index page and we're initially loading in these steps, You can see your trigger load steps in tab 1 tour. I'm only going to do that when views tab 1 steps added is no. So what I'm going to say is, if that custom state is no, go ahead, add in more steps. But if that's set to yes, then we do not need to add the steps in again. So what we can do is we can say once the steps are loaded, we don't need to do it again. So what we can do is we can set the state of a thing. The element or thing is going to be views tab 1, and the custom state steps added is going to be changed to yes. So we're not adding in steps again. So let's do the same thing for our second tab. We can say views tab 2, go to design, click on reuse with views, add a new custom state, steps added, question mark, and then state type again is going to be yes or no. Default is going to be no. But when we go back to index and click on workflow, we're going to say, okay, when we go to the second tab, we are triggering the load steps in tab 2 tour. We're only going to do that if views tab 2 steps added is no. And then when we do add the steps the very first time, just like in our first one here, we're going to set the state of an element. It's going to be views tab 2, steps added, and we'll set that to yes. Okay, so nearly there. Going to be one final step after this, but let's just refresh. Okay, so we're going through first, second, third, done. So this is good. And what we're going to see is we're going to be brought back to the first tab, but the tour will be triggered, which is not what we want, but it's only going to be the original steps. We're not going to have duplicate steps in there. So again, we're going through the tour and it's working pretty smoothly. We obviously don't want to do the tour every single time, but at least there's no duplicate steps added this time. And what we can do to get around the duplicate steps issue is if we go back to our database, I'm going to go into our data types. We're going to add a field here called first tour complete, and it's a yes no field. You can see the default is no. I'll come back to this restart tour field a bit later on. So let's go into our database, create a new user. And I'm just going to say John Doe at testmail.com. And first tour complete by default should be set to no. Restart tour should be set to no. We'll create that. And then we're going to say we're only going to start this product tour A if the current user's first tour complete is set to no. And we'll do the same thing on the other tab. We're only going to start the product tour if the current user's first tour complete is no. And then what we can say is once they've completed the tour, we're going to change this entry in our database from no to yes. So if I go to workflow, what I can do is I can say when product tour B is completed, because remember, even though it is one continuous tour for our users, in reality split between the two tours, and product tour B is the latter one. So we're going to say product tour B. We're going to say make changes to the current user, and we're going to change their first tour complete to yes. So let's just run as that user we created, John Doe at testmail.com. First tour complete set to no. And you can see here the tour is popping up, first, second, third, done. And then if we go back to the first tab, nothing happens. We flick between the tabs, nothing happens. And importantly, if we refresh our page, again, nothing happens. So the tour is only going to run the one time. Now, you may wish for your users to have the options to go through the tour again. And what you can do is if you go back to the area where all of the reusable elements is housed, so that's this group here in my case, you can add a button and drop it in there. And you could call it restart tour. And just put that down the end as it is at the moment. And what you could say is add workflow. And you could just start a product tour. And we'll go for product tour A. And this won't work perfectly, but it's quite easy to fix. So we'll refresh our page. And if you click on this, everything works fine on the first tab. But if we go to the second tab, you can see nothing shows up. And the reason nothing shows up on the second tab is because if we go back to our workflow, you can see here when we're going to the second tab, that's traditionally when we trigger this step of adding in the steps in the tour, but we can't do this because we're only doing it when the steps added is no, and we're only starting the product tour when the current user's first tour complete is also no. So it's actually the second step that's more relevant because this will happen, I suppose, depending on the custom state, but we're only going to start it when the first tour complete is no. But what we can do is we can also add a condition here that says we can also start the second part of the tour when the current user's restart tour is yes. So you might remember we had that second customed field in our user data type, restart tour. It's no by default, but let's say you wanted to click on restart tour, you could insert an action here and you could make changes to the current user and say, let's set your restart tour to yes. And then if you wanted to run that tour, you could do so. And then when product tour B is complete, we're going to change that back. So we're going to say restart tour, set it back to no. So let's try that again. We'll go back to the main tab and refresh. And now hopefully when we click on restart tour, we're going to get that. That all looks fine. And then we're brought to the second tab and still not working for some reason. So let's take a look at that. That should be loading it fine. So it's no, or when that's yes. Let's take a look at our user to make sure that changed. And we did say restart tour went to yes. So why wouldn't that have loaded? When the button restart tour is clicked, changing restart tour to yes. We go to this and we're saying start product tour B only when, because of course I should have had that as an OR field rather than an AND field. So let's refresh one more time. And we'll go back to our first part, assuming the user is going to go back here and click restart tour. 1, 2, 3, and that works as intended. You would need to use some conditional hiding because this is appearing now on the second tab. We don't want that. We only want this to be visible on the first tab. That's where the tour kicks off from. So what you would do is you would take the conditional rules you're using on your views tab 1. In my case, it's related to what's in the URL. Copy that and then choose your button and paste that in there as well. And then if we go back to the first tab, refresh our page. Page loads up, you have the option to restart the tour and you can go through it once again. But on the second tab, it's still visible because we forgot to do one thing. We forgot to untick this box and then also tick that box. So let's try that one more time. Refresh. The user is not seeing the tour load straight away because in our database, they have completed our first tour. But what we can do, and we should refresh our data, that's currently set to no because they have restarted it. They have not restarted it just yet. When they click on restart, that's going to change to yes in our database, which means that we can trigger this tour. We'll go to next, 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 and then the tour is done. And you can see there's no restart tour button on this particular tab because it's all linked to the button that's on the first one. So there you go. Bit complicated at times, but I think it's really useful if you're developing a SPA application and you want to give your users a good onboarding experience. If you have any other questions, you can let me know in the comment section.